Well, I'm Julia Griffin, so I am, how would I describe myself? Well, primarily as I'd probably say like a movement dance artist, but having sort of crossed over into sort of like video art and installation. So I used to be a sort of part memorial, part dementia research and part bereavement therapy, and it sort of closes this 15-year loop of me looking after my mum and dad, both of which who had vascular dementia. So it sort of closes that loop. And obviously part of the problem with dementia is they repeat themselves and they repeat themselves, and you get sort of in this loop. So as a carer, especially for my dad, who passed away in October, he got into this sort of repetition, not the same way that my mum did. And so I used to be basically it's a culmination of two immersive performances, which was Stuck, which was about my mum and about my understanding of her journey in dementia and how I viewed her as a daughter. And then I used to be is this whole thing as I used to be a daughter, I'm no longer, I am an orphan. And so the journey is sort of my dad's journey, but how they then connect back together. And so this is a collaboration between myself, Helen Newell and Dave Forrest. And we worked with a soundscape artist called Steve Davis Moon. His material isn't in this particular immersive exhibition, but it was in Stuck. And I like to reference him because there's traces of sort of his influence. My dad and my mum were old-time waltz champions, so they loved dancing. And so it was really interesting. My mum used to do Swinging to Shape, which was like a routine of sort of keep fit. And as she was progressing with her illness, she couldn't remember the routines. So it was really interesting. If you held her and you could waltz with her, she would be able to move, but she wouldn't be able to do those things on her own because of the steps. And so with my dad, I'd put on his favourite music and he'd love to dance. So we'd get up and we'd dance to sort of like Dixieland, trad jazz, and he loved all of that. So moving like that's really important, you know, cognitively and kinesthetically, you know, the sensation of it. And so, because obviously I used to be has so many sort of narratives to it. One of the narratives is the carer's journey through looking after somebody. I suppose what I want to highlight is I'm highlighting the sort of the role of the carer, because I think with dementia there's an awful lot of research about the disease and how it affects those that have dementia. And I think what then gets overlooked is the people actually that have to look after people with dementia is often very overlooked. And also the care, you know, as we know about sort of care at the moment, it's in crisis because people aren't paid enough, you know, to do what ultimately is a very intimate role. You know, you've got to look after people, you know, with respect and dignity. And I think that whole process of caring for someone is not really talked about a lot. So I suppose with I Used to Be it's my journey, so it's autobiographical, it's my journey, it's what, you know, it's 15 years now since, you know, I think, well, my perception of myself as a daughter radically changed, and my perception of people who care for others radically changed. Quite a lot of my own visual sort of work that I do, my video work, is I'm really interested in the whole notion of the deconstruction of very old formats. So I quite like using the old mini DV tapes and re-recording over them. And so that process of sort of degradation, so what happens to the image once it's been recorded over and then recorded over again, then recorded over again and then recorded over again. And I do that with my artwork now. It's a very similar process. So I buy a canvas from a charity shop that has an image already on it. I paint over that image and then I repaint. And then I repaint, and then I repaint. So a lot of the work that's downstairs in the freezer, sounds really bizarre, but in the freezer rooms are all these repainted images. And with each repetition, something different slightly emerges. It's never exactly the same. You know, hearing something again and again, it's like saying the word and once you say it lots and lots of times, it sort of has this different sort of resonance. So yeah, so I'm really interested in that, in sort of choreographic terms, in visual terms and in auditory terms as well, that use of repetition. I could call it like it's a subterranean sort of landscape. And it almost feels like it could be a really weird industrial cave, because the pillars almost feel like stalactites and stalagmites. But the two rooms that are situated in it, one's really quite large. You could do something in that space alone without even looking at the rest of the enormity of that space. And I think they're, because of their sort of like connection to food and sort of, you know, all of the retail is brought into this sort of like very dark, dimly lit, not at all attractive space. And then they're sort of like, they're disappeared into the lift shafts and taken up into this gleaming white, clean space. I quite like that idea of where they're coming from is like an earthy cave up into this very clean, heavenly space of retail. My career has always been about collaboration, about how do you use your skill base with somebody else's skill base. How does that dialogue, how does that creative dialogue create new work and new ways at looking at artistic practice? And I was once referred to as Miss Blunderbuss, you know, the ineffectual shot, because my practice has ranged across from sort of doing work with Rumours of Fleetwood Mac, which is a tribute band for Fleetwood Mac, one of the best, working with them, to working with Marina Abramovich, doing an installation of hers called Luminosity. And that journey for me, because it's been so sort of disparate and very different and challenging, I think it's informed my work tenfold. So, you know, movement for me has means so many different things now. It's not just the dance training that I had in the past, where it was sort of quite, I wouldn't say one-dimensional, because I think that's a bit unfair, but I think it sort of allowed you only a certain avenue to go down in terms of performance. And so my performance work has really radically altered because of being able to collaborate in those different ways with different artists. Very exciting it was. She's an amazing lady, and so Luminosity was a re-performance of her solo work, and there was artists that were selected to work with her based on a very casual inner circle discussion, which was quite interesting, and so it was great. So we met her and we met William Dafoe as well, so yeah, it was interesting. And then of course there's Black Grape, so there's sort of like going from sort of high art to sort of pop to, you know, so it's been a really sort of interesting, how many decades? Yeah, 4 decades of work. For me, I think art's all around, movement's all around, and I think sometimes we wait to get funded, you know, and apply for funds to think, right, okay, well I need a bit of money to do this. Ultimately, you need to be paid for what you do. I think that's really important. But then again, you've got to do your work, and if you're waiting on funding, you could wait a long time and never do it. So I think you've just got to grab your opportunities when they're there, and there's lots of places that I think are ripe for those opportunities to emerge, and I think we tend to be a little bit sort of bound by, oh, it needs to be like this or it needs to be like that. Well, no, it doesn't. Yeah, I think it's opening our eyes to the possibilities that we have all around us. Warrington has this proximity between Manchester and Liverpool, and for me it's a really exciting hub. There's something about the confluence of the rivers as well, the waterways that come into Warrington. I know Warrington's sort of quite at high risk of flooding, but there's something about Warrington as well. I think it's a really interesting place. You know, I think there's, especially at the moment, it feels like there's a lot of creative energy in Warrington.